Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Kanaser, and you're watching the VMM Library, Profiles and Templates. So every lesson that we complete, we are peeling back one more layer of that private cloud build. And you'll find that in this lesson, we are going to transform the way you think about enterprise IT in general, about the processes that we've developed over the years. You're going to find that, when virtualization came along, we didn't really change much, right? So we took what we were doing in the physical world and we essentially implemented it in the virtual world with some minor changes, but it was the same thing. We were using physical servers, and towards the end, they were using Ghost and Altiris and other tools, SCCM, to create different images for different hardware types and operating system versions and application versions. On top of that, we had these complicated code names for the images, and we came to a point where it was image sprawl. Well, when we migrated into the virtual world, we adopted the concept of the templates, and we started doing the same thing with the templates. A template for every type of application: Exchange 2003, on server 2003, on service pack 1, on this particular how many procs, etc. Again, we ended up with template sprawl in the virtualization layer. So again, the same processes, same things we were doing in the physical world, we imported into the virtual world. Well, you'll find that with the private cloud, we're going to start to branch out. We're going to start to get more organized. We're going to start to have more repeatable processes. We're going to start to have rules that apply to us administrators the same way as they apply to the end user. What we're putting in place is not just for them. It's going to govern our behavior. The processes are going to change. Our tools are going to change. And this is what brings us to the library. The library is one of those newer tools at our disposal. The concept isn't new. It's just that the function in what we do on a day-to-day basis is new. So what is the library? Well, the library is the same thing as a bookstore library or a book library that you walk into. There are certain things that are indexed, certain other things that are not indexed. There are certain things that we see on the bookshelves, and other things that the library uses in the back end that are functions that we don't see. Well, the same concept kind of applies here. Let's take a look at the library. Within the library, you're going to find assets. These assets are things that you as the IT administrator are going to need to use. And I'll show you some of these in a second here. But these are the things that you're kind of constantly need to get. Those are going to be indexed, they're going to be organized, you're going to have easy access to them. Now within the library, there are two things that I also want to draw your attention to. There's the library server. Now the library server is going to contain things like ISOs and templates and images and stuff like that. The library server can be any IT file server where it's a share and then you just import it into the library for indexing and organization. Again, the library server is kind of your resources as the IT administrator that you're bringing on from different parts of the network, in addition to some of the other things that we'll see in the library in a second. The cloud library, on the other hand, is a collection, is a repository, it's a place, it's a location where you're able to make available to your self-service users resources that they can consume. These resources you've prepackaged, you have vetted, you've determined that these are the resources that they could potentially use. You're making them available, and then they can use them at their disposal, whenever they want, essentially. But you're making them available. You're approving these resources from being allowed for them to use them. So these are essentially, the kind of the two types of libraries that we have within the VMM library. Now again, I told you that there are certain things that are going to be indexed, they're going to be organized, and other things that are not going to be indexed. Among the things that are going to be indexed are virtual hard disks. These can be .vhd from an extension perspective, .vhdx, this applies to Hyper-V and XenServer. You've got .vmdk for vSphere, ISOs with a .iso. You've got VM templates in there. You've got answer files, PowerShell scripts, SQL Server scripts, SQL Server data tier applications, DAC packs. Those are going to be available in there as well. You're going to have web deploy packages, a whole bunch of things that are on the screen here. Those are going to be very well indexed for you, and we'll discuss some of them a little later on in this lesson and in some other lessons. Now on the flip side, you're going to have resources within your library that are not going to be indexed, such as the VM export files, .exp. You're going to have the VM saved state files, the VM memory files, the configuration files. Any VHDs, ISOs, or VFDs that are attached to VMs will also not show up as indexed within your library resources. Now, we also have the concept of profiles. Now, you'll note that, again, in the traditional way we've been doing things, we've gradually moved from the physical to the virtual. In the virtual, what we did is we installed an operating system, installed an application, put the right packages, the patches, etc., and voila, this is our template, and this is how we deploy it. Well, not only did it make it difficult because we had template sprawl, we had a lot of templates, but updating them was a mess, and we didn't always abide by them. And sometimes we just right-click and just create the whole thing all over again. It was just not an easy, clean, repeatable way of doing things. So what you'll find with profiles, with the introduction of profiles, well, the concept is not new, but the way we're using it is going to be new. And you're also going to find that the focus on the virtual machine has kind of changed. In the early days of virtualization, all the focus was on the virtual machine. The virtual machine was the most important piece of the whole puzzle. Everything was about the VM. In a private cloud, the VM is still very important, but the focus is not on the VM anymore. The focus is on all of these layers around the VM that are going to make the VM better. So how are we going to deploy from templates in a better way, in a more reusable, more structured way? Well, we're going to use profiles. We're going to have different types of profiles that we'll use at provisioning. These layers are going to come together to provision the virtual machine based on what we want to do. So instead of having everything in that template and then powering it on and voila, that's what we've got, we're going to have a virtual hard disk with, say, just the operating system on it, maybe some features that we've enabled within the configuration. We're going to layer on top of that guest operating system profile. So the guest OS profile is going to contain things like what's the name of the machine, the password, the domain, etc. All of these things get layered on top. We're also going to layer the hardware profile. The hardware profile is going to determine how many processors, how much memory, how much disk, what network it's connecting to. That's the hardware profile. These come together and collectively provision that virtual machine for you, as I'm going to show you in a second. But I wanted you to be aware of the different types of profiles. We're not going to discuss all of these profiles in this lesson. We're going to talk about the hardware profiles, and you'll see in parentheses, I've essentially specified what that hardware profile relates to. We're also going to discuss the guest operating system profile. We're going to talk about the capability profile. The capability profile we're going to talk about, it's important because in order for us to create our cloud, we have to understand the capability profile. And I'll go into more details about that, once we get into the GUI. But in a nutshell, I told you earlier lessons that the flexibility of having a private cloud that has multiple hypervisors is because sometimes you want to run certain workloads on different types of hypervisors. Well, with a capability profile, we're going to determine what is the minimum and maximum workload that can be run on a Hyper-V host as opposed to an ESX host as opposed to a Xen server host, so that when you're placing the VMs in the cloud, you have the option of determining where you're applying it against. And then if you're putting it against a capability profile that is incompatible, it's going to say, hey, I am not the right profile for that. Application profiles and SQL Server profiles are what we're going to talk about in later lessons when we talk about services and service templates and stuff like that. So those we're going to leave for later on. And the virtual hard disk is pretty much self-explanatory. It's essentially the building block. It's the installation of the OS with some features and roles and stuff like that. Now, you also have primarily two types of templates. You have the virtual machine template and the service templates. In this lesson, we're not going to talk about service templates. We're going to focus on virtual machine templates. And like I told you a second ago, in order to create virtual machine template, in order to deploy from virtual machine, there are three essential things that you're going to need to have. You're going to need to have a virtual hard disk profile, which is where we're going to install the OS and features and roles, blah, blah, blah. Then we're going to need a hardware profile, and then we're going to need a guest operating system profile. These are three prerequisites in order for us to provision virtual machines. So you see the shift in mentality on the VM. It's not just the VM anymore. It's not just about right-click and create VM, put an operating system on it, and on you go. It's about creating a hard drive that is plain vanilla, right? It's very neutral. And then using that, leveraging that with profiles in order to get to the end result. So at provisioning time, these layers are going to come together to create the right virtual machine for the right purpose, for the right service that you are trying to create. That way you no longer need to have different types of templates with different types of applications and versions. No. We're going to try to simplify it, maybe even have one virtual machine with the use of profiles, bring everything together to create the ideal configuration for the service that we're creating. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the VMM management console and let's create our cloud. Now, before we can click on this very nice, cute little button here, let's go ahead and click on the library node down here. And let's take a look at the capability profile. Now, before we can create the cloud, I want you to have a good understanding of what the capability profiles are. If you click on them, after you expand profiles, you'll find that you have 3 by default that are created for you. Now, essentially, again, these are where you configure minimums and maximums for the types of workloads that are going to go on each one of these hypervisors. And again, you're going to need to have that flexibility within your private cloud. Maybe you have VDI workloads that are ideal for XenServer. Maybe you have high intense database servers, SQL, Oracle, SAP maybe, that are probably more ideal for ESX servers, or more compatible or only supported with ESX. And maybe everything else will go on Hyper-V, or vice versa. It could be any combination of all of the above. Maybe ESX has better integration with the storage, with the VAI, and things like that, where certain workloads you want to deploy on ESX. Well, in order for you to configure your capability profile, you're going to right-click, let's say, for instance, on Hyper-V down here. We're going to come down to Properties, and you're going to select your capabilities here. And then for each one of those, you are going to go through and essentially, from a processor's perspective, you're going to say that for Hyper-V, I'm going to support 1 through, let's say, 8 virtual processors. And the reason you might want to do that is because the hardware that you are applying the capability profile against, maybe it's a blade with 2 sockets, right? You don't have 64 virtual CPU capabilities. You got a physical constraint to that. So maybe you do that with 8, so that any virtual machine that you try to deploy on your Hyper-V hosts that has more than 8 processors will fail. It will not go through. It will not let you provision it. You're going to do the same thing for memory. You're going to do the same thing for disk. What are you going to do with memory? What are you going to do with disk, your DVD, etc.? This is the capability profile. Again, those are just minimums and maximums for what's going to be allowed to run on these different types of hypervisors. For now, I'm going to leave everything at default. I just wanted you to be aware of where those are and what function they serve. So let's go ahead and collapse profiles, and let's go through and actually create a cloud. You guys ready? Excited? Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to click on the button. Now, I found the ideal name for my private cloud. I like the name Enterprise Private Cloud, EPC, and my company happens to be Wired Brain Coffee. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it WEPS, W-E-P-C. Tell me that's not cool. Now, I think it's a mouthful from a description perspective, so I'm going to leave this one blank. Feel free to explain what it is if you choose to do so. We're going to click on Next here, and then we're going to select, well, what hosts are going to participate in my cloud? Well, I'm going to select, for now and for the purpose of our example, my prod host group, which has all 3 of my Hyper-V hosts. I have a collective 8 gig of memory, and I have plenty of disk space here. I also have 3 physical CPUs within those hosts. Now, recall I had added some Virtual Center and ESX and XenServer. I've removed those just because I had to power them off, and when you power them off, VMM starts to give you some errors, and you can't contact them. So I've removed those from the environment. If you're following along, and if you have all the resources at home that I have, you probably want to remove them at this point just because you don't want to see all these errors, and I had to power them down anyway to free up some resources. So I don't have any of those, but if you had VMware ESX hosts in the environment, you can also select those and add them to your cloud. Click Next. This is the logical network that we've been working on and that we created within our environment. I'm going to select that and click Next. We're not going to be using any network load balancing at this point, so I'm going to skip the load balancer configuration and also the VIP configuration here. You'll find that the port classifications that we created earlier for fast, which is 10 gig, slow, 1 gig, if you wanted to use those, you can select those. Now, why are we selecting those? Well, this is what is going to be made available to your end users when we create the self-service portals and stuff like that. Now, keep in mind, you're making available fast and slow, and you're going to probably say, well, they're always going to select fast. Well, not necessarily, because fast can be quantified now. There's a dollar amount against fast. You can do chargeback. You can do showback. You can charge for this resource. Okay, they can't all choose fast. It's going to cost them, and when dollars are involved, they'll think twice about that. So this is what you're making available from a network perspective, and this is what we're making available from a storage perspective. Recall how everything is starting to come together. All the pieces that we've been building in earlier lessons are kind of now coming together to form this cloud. And again, you have your gold standard, you have your platinum standard, and depending on what they're trying to provision, what they're trying to use, well, they might have a capacity or not. So, and they might have to pay for that. So we're going to leave those. We're going to select Next. This is where we're specifying the library where we're going to store our virtual machines. You can click on Browse here. I'm just going to stick it in essentially the root here of the library. And if you had any read-only resources, again, if you're trying to mount ISOs and stuff like that, you can select to add those here. For now, I'm just going to leave that as blank. Now, at this point, you are being asked, do you want to put any kind of capacity constraints around this cloud? So while you have all of these resources, do you want to allow the full usage of these resources, or do you want to cap them at some point? Now, I can very rarely think of an example where you'd want to cap. For the most part, you're always going to want to consume all of the resources. But in the scenario or the example where you would need to cap how much resources can be consumed out of your cloud, you can come in here and specify that from a virtual CPU perspective, I only want you to use 4 out of 8, for example. We're going to click on Next to continue. And again, what is the capability profile that you want to associate with this cloud? If you had more than just Hyper-V, you would obviously associate more than that. For now, we're just going to do Hyper-V. And that's the summary. When you're ready for it, are you ready? We're going to click Finish. And there you go. We're going to click on Finish. And yeah, it's done. No, I'm serious. The cloud has been created. So all of these years that you've been hearing about cloud and the complexity of the cloud, we just created a cloud within, I don't know, a few minutes. So under here, if you come under clouds, you'll see that my web's cloud has now been created. Now there's really nothing under it yet. I haven't done anything with it. But the cloud, the infrastructure for the cloud has been created. So you can take a minute to pause the video and catch your breath and think about this for a second. But the cloud's been created. Now the first thing we want to do is we want to start working with templates. But before we can start working with templates, we need to have at least one virtual machine. So we need to create that virtual machine. To do that, what I want to do first is under my cluster here, I'm just going to right click on it, drag down to where it says create virtual machine. And this kickstarts the wizard, very similar wizard, you're probably familiar with this. You can create a virtual machine in any number of ways. You can create it from another virtual machine, you can create it from a VM template. You can create it from a hard drive, right? Well, unfortunately, we don't have any of those. This is plain vanilla. This is our new environment. We need to create this from scratch. And this is where we're going to select the second option here, which is create a new virtual hard disk image here. We're going to select it. And let me just go ahead and do this. We're going to click on Next. And we're going to name this. So in my environment, I'm just going to name this W2K12. And let's do gold. We're going to click on Next. Now, once we get through the first virtual machine creation, you'll find that we're going to create hardware profiles, and we'll start to use those for the deployment. But right now, I don't have anything. This is completely plain vanilla from scratch that we're doing this. So I'm going to select the processor. I just need one from a memory perspective. You can specify how much memory. I'm going to keep it a dynamic. And you can go through the entire thing here of figuring out what you want to configure from a hard disk perspective. Do you want to change the size of this disk? Or not, and you also want to make sure that you are connecting some kind of an ISO so that we can deploy this virtual machine from. So if you come here and select virtual DVD, you'll find that no media is connected. You can obviously connect it to the physical CD of the actual host. In most cases, those servers are going to be in the data center, so access to them isn't going to be easy. So this option is out of the question. So what you would want to do is configure an existing ISO image so that we can use it. Now, if you select this and click on Browse, you'll find that I don't have anything in my library. So I don't have any ISOs in here. We have several options to address this. If you're familiar with vSphere, vSphere has kind of the same problem. In order for you to use the ISOs, you have to copy them into a data store and then connect them to the VM, or you have to mount one of your CIFs through PowerShell scripts and stuff like that in order to make them available so that the virtual machines can be connected. Well, the same thing applies here. You have to copy that ISO into a repository that the virtual machine can see before you can use that ISO image. So I don't have anything, so let's go ahead and address that. Now to do that, we're going to cancel out of this wizard. We're going to click on the library node down here, and let's take a look at the library servers. So right now I have, during the installation of VMM, we created this particular library server. Now this library server has a bunch of default assets that are already available as part of the installation, the default installation. These include, blank hard disks. These include custom resources that we're going to be using later on in later lessons. For instance, application packages, whether those applications are web applications or V applications that we can later use to deploy templates and services and things into our environment. But none of these constitute an ISO file. Now, you'll notice up here that you have the ability of importing a lot of things into your library. You can import templates, you can import physical resources, you can export things. Now, from an import physical resources perspective, if you click on it, you can add custom resources, you can add resources. And under resources here, you'll find that all of the things that I was talking about during the presentation from what type of asset is included here. So you can import any of these assets. Now, we can browse to the location of where my ISO is and import that ISO. What are you doing though if you do that? Well, so at that point you have two repositories, right? You have your IT file server where you're already storing all of your ISOs. And then you have this library where you have to constantly import ISOs. Well, storage isn't going to be the problem. You probably have a lot of storage, but the problem is going to be managing these things, right? And constantly wanting to copy ISOs from one location to another. Well, if there's an easy way of doing it, why don't you just connect your IT file server that already has all the ISOs in there, and voila, you can make that available to all of your users, in addition to the fact that you have to manage it from one place, your regular file explorer, whatever it is. You don't have to constantly import it. Whereas here, not only do you have to manage it separately, but you also have to go through the import process to import that ISO, which makes it kind of cumbersome. So if you wanted to add a new IT file server in your environment, what I would want you to do is under library servers, and again, depending on how you have your lab set up, you might want to do this. Right click on library server, click on add library server, select the run as account that you want to associate with that. Click on next, find the actual server, the IT file server that you want to add. Click on add here, it's going to display the shares, and select the shares and go through the wizard. Now, in my environment, and because I have kind of limited amounts of servers, I've created an ISO share on the actual VMM server itself. Now, think of this as my IT file server. Now, because I've already associated VMM 01 in the library servers here, I just need to add a share. I don't need to add an entire server. So what I'm going to do is just right click on it, click on add library shares. And again, this is on the root of C of my VMM server that I'm trying to treat as a file server. You'll find here that it's in C ISOs, and you need to share that. So at this point, again, you probably want to pause the video, go on to that IT file server that you're trying to import here, and make sure you are sharing that particular directory before you can successfully accomplish this. Once you get here, you're going to select ISOs, and we're going to click on next. Get a summary screen like this. We are going to click on add library share. And voila, it has completed successfully. We're going to close out of here. And you'll notice in my library now, I have a new asset. That is the ISO for Windows Server 2012 standard that I'm going to use to deploy my virtual machine from. So I can now connect my virtual machine. So let's try this again. Let's go to VMs and templates here. Under my cluster, we're going to right click. We're going to create a virtual machine. Let's do this. We're going to select the second option here. We're going to click on next. Let's do W2K12 gold. Let's click on next. From a processor perspective, I'm going to leave it as is. From a memory perspective, I'm going to select dynamic. Let's scroll down to the actual virtual DVD here. And let's select existing ISO. Let's click on browse and let's select it. Very easy when things work, isn't it? Click OK. Now, let me share with you what this actual share image file instead of copying it means. And I believe that Microsoft has actually implemented this feature because it saw some of the challenges that VMware was having with connected media. For those of you that come from the VMware world that have been using it for a while, you probably know that if you have a DVD connected to a virtual machine, vMotion will probably fail. It won't work because the destination host where you're going doesn't have that association. It becomes a mess. Microsoft's way of kind of getting around that so that live migrations don't fail, it's going to copy that ISO and put it into the folder of that virtual machine. So that ISO essentially is always there, and as a result, live migration will not fail. Now, that's definitely a good workaround. It works, right? Except you're going to have tens and hundreds of these ISO images, deduplicate ISO images, on your storage all over the place. Now, sure, you could do deduplication and you could do 100 things, but it's kind of creating the duplication so that you can use the deduplication engine. Well, can we avoid the duplication in the first place, kind of, so that we don't have to deduplicate? And also, it makes the whole virtual machine larger than it needs to be when you're doing storage live migration and you're moving things around. We don't want to have unnecessary copies of the same file laying around all over the place. And frankly, even if it didn't have this option that I'm going to talk about in a second here, I would much prefer if it failed and forced me to address it rather than create a workaround that is just cumbersome. I would much rather it fail and let me address it. But okay, so what did Microsoft come up with as kind of an alternative if you don't want it to copy the file? Well, it came up with this option, which is to share the image instead of copying it. So what essentially it is asking you to do here is I will share the image from the file server or from wherever location that it's at to all of the Hyper-V hosts so that I don't have to copy it. Now you'll notice that it says it might require additional configuration, and it does require additional configuration. That configuration happens to be on the domain controller. So let's switch over and I'll show you what additional configuration you need to do in order to make sure that this option works. On our domain controller, DC01, if you open up Active Directory users and computers, you'll need to locate the actual computer accounts for your Hyper-V hosts. Now, let's start with Hyper-V 01. If you right-click on it, drag down to Properties, and find Delegation. So what Microsoft wants you to do is use the idea of constrained delegation to grant the server that is hosting the ISO file access to share that ISO over CIFS or SMB or any other protocol that you could be using to those Hyper-V servers. In order to do that, you have to, on the actual Hyper-V host, the computer accounts, make or grant that access to the IT file server where the ISO is. In my case, it's VMM01. So what I want to do is I want to trust the computer for delegation to specified services only. I'm going to use any authentication down here for the protocol. We're going to click on Add, and we are going to make that association. So in my case, it's VMM01. That is the computer account that needs that delegated rights. Once you click on OK, it's going to ask you, okay, you want delegated rights over what type of protocol? In my case, it's going to be CIFS. So I'm going to select CIFS. We're going to click on OK. And then we're going to do an apply, and we are going to click on OK. And voila. Now, you have to repeat this process for Hyper-V 2 and 3. I've already done that, so this would be a good time to pause the video, apply those same permissions to Hyper-V 2 and Hyper-V 3. Let's go back and finish up the creation of our virtual machine. Now at this point, you have the option of selecting the share because you've met all of the necessary requirements to enable this. We're going to click on Next. And do you want to deploy this virtual machine into your private cloud? Do you want to deploy it on just one of the hosts? Do you just want to store it in the library for later use? Well, we have a cloud, so let's go ahead and deploy it in our cloud. We'll click on Next here. And you'll notice that you have to actually select your cloud from the top right-hand corner. So I'm going to select WEPS. And once you've selected WEPS, it should go through the ratings in a second here and tell you, which host is more appropriate for this virtual machine to be deployed on. Now, this is taking a little too long, and I think I missed a step. Instead of kind of stopping the video and trying to correct it, let me show you what I missed during this so that you're aware of what happened. Let's go ahead and click on Previous here and go back one more. We actually forgot to kind of associate this with a cloud capability profile. If we're going to deploy it to the cloud, we have to kind of associate it with a cloud capability profile. So if I select Hyper-V here and select Next again, so let's go back and try this one more time and click Next, and voila. You'll see that it now shows me the different types of hypervisors that I have in my environment and which one is more appropriate to deploy this VM on. So you'll find that Hyper-V 01 in my case is the most appropriate. The other ones are kind of 3.5 stars. This one is 4 stars, so it's more ideal than others. I'm going to select that. I don't have any kind of errors here. Everything seems to be working fine, so I'm going to select that, click on Next. If you want any actions to take place when the virtual machine powers on, or when the virtual machine stops, and if there's any delay between them, you have the option of selecting those. I'm just going to keep everything at default. We're going to click on Next here, and we are going to click on Create. Now you'll notice you don't see anything here, and that's because the view is set to services. If you select VM, voila, it's in progress. So once this completes, we are going to power on this virtual machine, And then we're going to go through just the regular traditional setup of Windows. So what I want to do at this point is we're not going to go through and I'm not going to show you the setup of Windows. It makes no sense. You guys have seen it, 100 times. I want you to pause the video and make sure you've completed this entire installation of Windows Server, whether it's 2008, 2012, or whatever you're using. In my case, we're also going to pause the video for a few seconds here while this completes. Again, once this goes to 100%, you need to power it on. Once you power it on, it's just going to go into setup and you're going to go through the installation of that virtual machine. Oh, well, there you go. Since it's completed, let's just right click on it and let's go through and power it on here. And let me also show you the console. Might as well. I'm a nice guy. Again, nothing special. I'm just going to get this started and then we'll pause this until it finishes, but just go through the complete installation of the actual operating system. And just bring it, obviously, to a Control-Alt-Delete screen. And there it is. Our virtual machine has been created. So what I want to do now is actually power it off. We're just going to select anything. And let's go ahead and exit out of here. All right, so we've created the virtual hard disk. We've deployed the operating system. We are one step closer to being able to create our first VM template. Now, recall when we were talking during the presentation, I told you there were several prerequisites to creating a virtual machine template. We need a guest operating system profile, we need a hardware profile, and we need a virtual hard disk. So let's go take care of those under the library here. What we want to do is expand profiles. And let's start with a guest operating system profile. Right click on that, create, and we can give it a name. Now, here is where you can start to get into customizing what this is going to be applied against. This is where you can apply some of the processes that you're used to, whereas the name has the version and what type of operating system and stuff like that. Well, there's one difference though here, is now the library is organizing things, it's indexing things, and it's not the entire VM that you're copying all over the place. These are small files that you're creating profiles out of. So in my case, this one's going to be W2K12, and let's just call it that, W2K12 for now. You can give it a description if you choose to do so. And under the guest operating system profile, if you select that, you have the option of changing several different things. So for instance, the computer name, right now it's just going to give it a random computer name. You can obviously go through and change that. From an admin password perspective, if you want to specify a different admin password, which is probably a good idea, and what I'm going to do right now, you can specify the admin password. From a product key perspective, again, up to you. Time zone, I'm in Central Time, so this works out pretty well for me from an operating system perspective. You can choose what type of an operating system you want to use. I've obviously been using the Windows Server 2012 operating system, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that. And I'm using the standard edition, so I'm going to select that. From a roles and features perspective, you have the option of selecting any kind of roles or features that you want to create or to add. And it's obviously telling you here that in order to do this, you have to be using Windows Server 2008 R2 or higher, which we obviously are using. So these are some of the options that you can select here that you can change. From a domain, again, you can choose what domain this is going to be part of. In my case, it's going to be wiredbraincoffee.com. You can specify the username and password that's going to add this machine to the domain, or you can select the run as account. In my case, I'm going to use my run as account, might as well since I've created it. Under the answer file, if you've created any kind of answer file, you have the option of browsing to it and selecting it at that point. And then under here, you have the option of specifying any commands that you want to add that would run after this virtual machine comes up for the first time, essentially. So this is how you are creating that guest operating system profile for this type of virtual machine. You've created a lot of these questions and answers, and you've added what you need to add here. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And there it is. And let's go back in here real quick. I believe I might have selected the wrong guest operating system. Right-click Properties, and let's go into Guest Profiles here and select Operating System. Yeah, no wonder that roles and features wasn't being selected. That was a little tricky. So once you once you select Windows Server 2012 Standard, the the roles and features show up, and you have the option of selecting which ones you want. So in our case, let's just go ahead and select .NET. That seems to be a something that is used on a frequent basis. So if I select .NET here, and we click on OK, if you're using Windows Server 2008 SQL Server, I mean, you might need to use the .NET 2.0 or 3.0. But just for the purposes of demonstration, let's say we select .NET here, and we're clicking on OK. That creates that first guest operating system profile. So what we want to do now is create a hardware profile. So again, because virtual machines have an abstraction between the actual hardware and the software, we have the option at deployment of specifying a different hardware profile type. So maybe we're deploying from the same virtual machine hard disk, we're deploying a virtual machine with 8 virtual CPUs versus a virtual machine with 2 virtual CPUs. Traditionally, that would be really hard to change, or you would have to probably create another template, and you'd have multiple templates for just changing the hardware profile. Well, here it's just a simple small file that again is very indexed properly and an easy place to find. So right click, create hardware profile, and you can give this again whatever name you want, again just to stay true to what we've been using. We're just going to do W2012. Click down here, and again you have the option of specifying, is this going to go against a particular cloud capability? So in this case I want to put it against Hyper-V maybe. How much processors? Again, we've gone through this when we were creating the virtual machine, so there's no point in doing this again. I'm just showing you this for giggles at this point. You can select dynamic from a COM port. Obviously, you can change a lot of those. The hard disk here, you can specify again what you're doing from a DVD. Because this is a hardware profile, I wouldn't recommend you configure any kind of DVD, but you have the option of doing so. From a network perspective, again, you have the option of putting it wherever you need to put that. You also have the option of enabling virtual machine spoofing. If you're going to do any kind of load balancing, for that matter, you'll have the opportunity of enabling that for load balancing and clustering and stuff like that. From an availability perspective, let's just scroll down real quick. From an availability perspective, if you want to make this virtual machine highly available, then you would want to come in here and essentially set it to high availability and select the type of virtual machine priority that this VM has at high priority, medium, low. Priority deals with, in the event of a host failure, which virtual machines are the highest priority that absolutely have to come up first. And depending on what you've chosen for the type of virtual machine, some virtual machines will come up before others, which will help you recover much quicker. Data center recoverability here. Right now, this one is set to disabled. We're going to leave it alone. CPU priority and the BIOS settings. Again, I'm not changing anything down here. From a virtual NUMA perspective, again, I'm not enabling or disabling. I'm just leaving everything at default. By default, it's allow virtual machines to scan hardware NUMA nodes. Hardware NUMA nodes are fantastic, especially when you're using operating systems or actually applications that can take advantage of hardware NUMA, so that they can take advantage of the amount of CPU to memory and can place workloads on the memory that is as close to the CPU where their workload is on, and process them much faster than you would if you hadn't had any NUMA. From a memory weight perspective, again, you have the option here of specifying what you want to do from a weight perspective. If there's contention in workloads, what gets how much weight, you have the option of specifying that. When you're ready, you can click on OK, and you've just created your first hardware profile. Okay, now that we have that, now that we have those things that we're trying to create for the VM template, let's go ahead and collapse that, and let's expand templates here. And you'll find that under that, you have the option of creating a VM template. So under VM template, what we're going to do is we're going to right click, and we're going to click on Create VM Template. When you do that, we come to this familiar screen again. Remember the screen? Well, this time, instead of essentially using a blank hard drive, we're going to use an existing hard drive. It's not going to be a VM template. It's going to be a virtual hard drive that we have available that we can use, or we can use a virtual machine that is deployed on a host, which is what we've got. So if you have a virtual hard disk in the library, you can use it. If you have a VM template already, you can use it. We just have a virtual machine, so we're going to select that, and there it is. We're going to click on OK. Let's go ahead and click on Next. And whoops, what is that? Now, this is interesting. In order for you to create a template out of this virtual machine, you have to destroy this virtual machine. So in order to create it, we have to destroy it. Now, they're also recommending that, hey, to prevent data loss, you might want to create a clone out of that virtual machine. So in order for us to abide by what they're saying here, we don't want to essentially go through this process again. I just want to make sure that we're going to create a clone out of it first so that we can destroy that clone and create a virtual template out of it. So we're going to click on no. We're going to exit out of here, say yes here, and we're going to go up to VMs and templates. And since I've powered this off, what I want to do is right click on it and drag down to where it says clone, which is under create, clone. W2K12 gold, let's do clone. Simple. We're going to click on next. You have the option here again of changing any of the hardware configurations of this particular clone if you wanted to. I'm just going to leave it at default. You can obviously always change that if you want to the profile that we just created a second ago, which is W2012. But for the purposes of this demonstration, let's just keep it at the default for now. Click on next here. Again, we're going to deploy it into our cloud. And we're going to select the WEPS cloud up here. We're going to put it on Hyper-V L1 for now. We're going to click on next. You've seen those already. Next, and create. Now, this is going to take a few minutes here to finish up the clone process of this virtual machine. And voila, a few minutes later, and this should be completed. And there you go. Once it's created, we can now create our template. So let's go back and do that. We can do that from here. We can do that from any number of places. So since we started here, let's just go back here. We're going to create a template. We are going to adjust this so that you guys can see better. We're going to browse, and we're going to take the actual clone that we just created so that our friends at Microsoft can now destroy it so that they can create a template out of it. So do you want to continue? Oh, yeah, I want to continue. And we can name this at this point whatever we want. Let's just call it, instead of clone, let's call it W2012 template. And give it a description. Next. Again, you can apply the hardware profile that you choose. In my case, I'm going to go through and apply the one that we just created. And you have the option of modifying it and going through any kind of changes that you want at this point. I'm happy with the way it is, so we're just going to click on next. Here you have the option of now deploying the operating system, the guest operating system profile. And again, because we've done all of this work already, I'm going to also deploy the W2012 guest operating system. And you see how it automatically populates everything in here. We're going to click on next. It's going to find the library that is going to associate with this particular template. So I'm going to, the only one that I have is this, and I don't have any errors, so I'm just going to go through with that. Select the library path where you'd want to store this in. I'm going to click on browse here, and I'm just going to put it in the actual root of the server down here. Click OK. Next. And we are going to get a summary screen. If everything looks okay to you, we are going to click on create to start the template process. Let's come down here to the jobs section. So we can open jobs from here. Or you can also launch jobs as a different window if you just click on this particular button up here. Obviously, if you select the actual job, it'll show you the different steps that it's going through in the creation of this template process. Now you'll notice that our creation of the template has completed with information, which means there are a few things that we have to address. For instance, we have to double check that the WinRM service is properly running on Hyper-V L3. And if you scroll a little down here, it's also give you some recommended actions on what you can do to address that. And also that the hardware changes during the creation of a template are kind of ignored. So just informational stuff that you have to address with recommendations. But our virtual machine template has been properly created. So if we go back up here into the library, you'll see that it's available for us. So I will not bore you with the creation of a virtual machine from template, but I will take you through the process even though we won't go through and create it. So if you right click on it now, you can select create virtual machine. and you get the same wizard that we've been working with. So let's say we call this one at this point W2K12-1, for instance. And if we click on next, again, you're going through the same deployment process. Now, one thing that you have to understand here is we used our profiles to create the template. Now we have the option, as we're deploying from template, if we want to change those profiles. Maybe you don't want to use the profile that you used during the template creation to provision a new virtual machine. And that's the beauty of it, is that the template is there to provide basic infrastructure, that basic hard drive, but then all the customization comes through the profiles. Now imagine if this was a different type of profile, then you can select it, click on next. Imagine that the guest operating system is again a different one, and you can select that as well. And you can click on next, and so on and so forth. You continue to your cloud deployment, figure out which one is the ideal host to deploy this on, and go through with the deployment. It is just another deployment just that we've been doing since the beginning of this lesson, so I don't want to bore you with that. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of that. And with that, that brings us to the end of this cool but kind of long lesson. I know that you must be tired by now, just because a lot of the tasks that we were doing here required pausing the video and waiting for that task to complete. And because we're working on lab hardware, you were probably waiting extended periods of time for the template to be created and the clone to be created and all that stuff. So I'm going to give you a break. You're going to go get yourself a pop, get yourself a beer, get yourself a water, coffee, whatever you need to get. But let's recap real quick before you go do that, what we learned in this lesson. So we talked about the different profiles and templates that you have available. We talked about the importance of understanding what profiles are and why they need to be used. We talked about the capabilities profile, which we used at the beginning of the lesson and went through the Hyper-V capabilities and what the minimums and maximums are for a workload to be deployed on Hyper-V. Hence, we created our private cloud based on that Hyper-V capability. We also looked at the different capabilities that you have, like you have the hardware capabilities or the hardware profile that we created for our Windows 2012 guest operating system profile as well. We then created a clone out of our virtual machine so that we don't destroy it as we're creating it. We then used that clone to create the template out of. And with that, I hope this lesson was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.